That is the opposite of America First. That's America in the subordinate position, the female position, the bottom in this relationship. And that's the opposite of what we thought we were getting and what they told us we were getting. It's such a betrayal that anyone attached to that is going to have a hard time reestablishing trust, even if he's a good man. And J.D. Vance is a good man, but I think it's hard. It's like, you're part of that. I mean, how could you betrayed us? And it's the betrayal that makes it so bitter for people like me and maybe you who voted for Trump, and I campaigned for and with him. It's like, really? We really believe that you were going to at least try? And in the end, it's all about cryptocurrency scams and wars for Israel?
Dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers, welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakavseli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead.
We've spoken a lot on this program about the U.S.-Israel relationship. We've also talked about its impact on domestic politics here in the United States, but we have not really devoted a full episode to talking about its contours and developments.
Until recently, the cause of Palestine in the United States had long been sidelined as a humanitarian concern, something that perhaps the Bleeding Hearts cared about, but not an issue that the average American had much of an opinion on. And if they did have an opinion, it tended to be reflexively pro-Israel, based on media saturation and residual Holocaust guilt. That's all now changed. In the months and years since October 7th, popular sentiment has turned sharply against Israel, and U.S. support for the Gaza genocide, and now the Iran war, has become a high-profile political issue.
We saw a lot of these kinds of changes happening on the Democratic side in 2024, but now it is increasingly showing up within the Republican Party, however marginal that community is. People like Thomas Massie, but also people very aligned with Trump's politics, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Tucker Carlson, even people like Nick Fuentes.
It's important to be measured about what we're actually seeing in terms of shifting policy, as opposed to shifting sentiment in the base more broadly. But it's still a big deal. U.S. support is absolutely vital for the endurance of the Zionist project, something not at all lost on the Zionists themselves. My personal theory is that they weren't planning on getting here, or at least not this quickly. I believe the Israelis thought the U.S. would eventually stop them in the months after October 7th. And something like the old dynamic would reconstitute itself. But the US under Biden didn't, and allowed Israel to fully commit to the genocide. And that has come at a considerable cost to Israel's reputation.
Now, there have been a lot of efforts by Israel to rehabilitate its image in the eyes of the American public, aided by loyal allies within this country. But increasingly, this is seeming like a lost cause. Instead, what Israel is doing is try to obscure the level of American support instead of having it out in the open, subject to congressional review and potential scrutiny.
Our guest today, Matthew Petti, an assistant editor at Reason magazine, has been covering a lot of these developments in his reporting, both for Reason and for other outlets. And in fact, he's got a new piece up at Dropsite exposing one of these strategies to concretize Israeli influence over U.S. policy. Using Florida's sunshine laws, he uncovered a new initiative, seemingly funded by Israel itself, called the State Legislator Israel Caucus, where pro-Israel state legislators can share model legislation with each other to pass in their respective states, such as laws prohibiting boycotts of Israel. It's got some great quotes from the initiative's co-founder, a very charming state legislator from Florida, and you should definitely check it out. We will be sure to include it in the show notes for this episode. But I think we would be remiss if we did not mention a particular figure who has been a stalwart defender of Israel on the right and in the Republican Party, one of its strongest fighters, who was taken from us tragically this morning. I am speaking, of course, of the Senator Lindsey Graham from the great state of South Carolina. We are recording this on Sunday, July 12th. So by now, dear listeners, you have already heard this news. I was informed of it very abruptly when Em shook me awake at 6 a.m. To whisper in my ear that Lindsey Graham was dead. And we shared a solemn moment. We took each other's hands together and we prayed. Seamus, how did the news affect you?
For legal reasons, I cannot say how I felt and what I said.
But I understand it that you've prepared some remarks.
Yes, if I could read them now.
Yeah.
I don't want to bore all of you with telling about Lindsey Graham, the man. Everyone knew him, and moreover, everyone loved him. It is impossible to describe what a brotherhood forged in adversity means to those who have not experienced it. Lindsey Graham and I were Air Force pilots together in Europe in the 1980s. He stuck mostly on base while I flew missions over. We were united in our belief that the world was changing for the better and that Walter Mondale would absolutely be the next president of the United States. I can't endorse the path that he went down later after Reagan visited our base, but brothers are brothers no matter who they voted for, and I hope that hellfire isn't that hot, buddy. I'll be right behind you. Rest in power.
Rest in power. Thank you, Seamus. That was extraordinarily powerful. And I think we are all holding you and everyone who knew Lindsey close to our hearts today. But the work continues. And today we are absolutely very lucky to have with us, as I mentioned, Matthew Petti. Matthew Petti is an assistant editor at Reason, who covers U.S. national security policy and its interactions with American society and domestic politics. He is an intrepid reporter and a prolific reporter, and you should check out his work at Reason and also for the BBC, the Intercept, Middle East Eye, and other publications.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by Matthew Petti. Matthew Petti is an assistant editor at Reason, who covers U.S. national security policy and its interactions with American society and domestic politics. Matthew, welcome to Turbulence.
Thanks for having me.
I did not prepare to open this way, but we were graced with the news this morning of the passage of one South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham.
Wow, that's the first I'm hearing of that.
But I do think he's an interesting figure in that, he kind of represents maybe an older school version of politics on the right, in particular with respect to his zealous advocacy for Israel. He, has been this figure of the voice for Netanyahu in DC, very vocal about his encouragement of Trump during the Iran war. When Trump is talking about, in the lead up to the ceasefire, Graham is that voice saying, no, keep the bombing going, etc. And there was even this very interesting exchange. Netanyahu was just this morning on television commenting about Lindsey Graham, and he's saying that, I told Lindsey, they're on a first name basis. I told Lindsey that we're a mature country now. We want to wean ourselves down from U.S. aid in the form of direct military grants. And Lindsey said, no. We want to ramp this aid up. And Netanyahu obviously is, using this to explain why Lindsey is such a good guy and zealous advocate for Israel. But I'm curious, how do you view Lindsey Graham? Is he a dying breed of Republican, or is he even just too eccentric to think of as representing anything at all?
I mean, he's Holden Blood Feast. He's literally the Holden Blood Feast meme. He's the respectable bipartisan who wanted, past tense, nothing more than to smell burning human flesh. I think he does represent pretty much old establishment neoconservative politics, or neocon is sort of a slippery term because it really refers to a very specific circle of people, but he sort of represents this establishment right-wing hawk politics. And I mean, look, Lindsey Graham, he is a dying breed in the sense that nobody sort of phrases it so straightforwardly as he does. But look at his successors in South Carolina, or his potential successors. It's people like Nikki Haley, Nancy Mace. It's sort of the same politics. So I think he is actually fairly representative of the sort of military-industrial complex, kill everybody kind of politics that existed. He is sort of he's personally a quaint figure as a sort of fruity Southern gentleman. That's definitely not representative of anything, but I think his policy priorities are pretty much what the sort of NatSec GOP policy priorities are and always have been.
Yeah, I think that Graham's policies were summed up pretty neatly when he was on stage at some convention. I actually don't remember what it was, some kind of Republican gathering pretty recently, and he's trying to extol the virtues of the Trump administration. He's like, what's not to like? We're bombing all the right people and we're cutting your taxes. And that does seem to be a nice encapsulation of the neocon brand of Republican worldview.
He recognized Jerusalem as capital of Israel. Why? Because if you got a problem with that, take it up with God. He's the guy that did it, not Trump. So I just want to say, I feel good about the Republican Party. I feel good about where we're going as a nation. We're killing all the right people and we're cutting your taxes. Trump is my favorite president. We've run out of bombs. We didn't run out of bombs in World War II. So, as a coalition of Republicans, some Baptist, some Jewish, we organize ourselves around principles that we love and we cherish. We love individual freedom. We love entrepreneurship. We love capitalism. We love Israel. We love the idea of Israel. We love the struggle they've been involved in. We love them, helping them because you're helping yourself. So to those who worry about these stupid interviews and far off places, don't worry. The Republican Party has figured it out when it comes to Israel. We understand that Israel is a friend of America to the bitter end. We understand that God blesses those who bless Israel. And where I come from, I figured that crap out when I was 6 years old. God bless you. Thank you very much.
Lindsey Graham has said a lot of really bloodthirsty shit. He talked about how we dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so why not Gaza? He talked about how the U.S., after October 7th, he's like, the U.S. should bomb Iran even if there's no evidence linking it. There was another quote of him where he said the doctrine of the Shiites in charge compels them to kill the Jews. Yeah, if he's exceptionally anything, he's sort of exceptionally forward and honest about his bloodthirst. Though, again, I think this is sort of, all of these things are sort of implicitly held views by a lot of Republicans and even some Democrats.
Yeah, and I'd like to get into that, right? Because the broader historical sequence that we're in that began after October 7th has really driven open a lot of political cleavages in both parties. And we saw that very evidently with the Democrats, where the Biden administration's active role in the Gaza genocide became this acute political problem for them in the 2024 election, which, as we know, they lost quite famously. But there's also been this growing skepticism of U.S. support for Israel within the Republican Party. And skepticism of figures like Lindsey Graham and their role. And it seems like we've seen that reach more of an acute inflection point with the fallout from the Iran war. And you've had figures like Tucker Carlson who have emerged to give voice to some of this skepticism. Although I'll add that did also start with the Gaza genocide, but really start to openly challenge Trump's relationship to the Israel lobby and the Israel lobby's influence over the Trump administration. And I think this has been a somewhat confusing, confounding development for a lot of people in the Palestine solidarity movement, but it didn't come out of nowhere. Can you tell us a bit what led to this moment of division that we're seeing on the right in particular?
So on one hand, I think that I don't like when people downplay it. I also don't like when people overplay it. I think what we're seeing is a immense generational divide over Israel within the Republican Party at the same time that it's not really represented at the political level intentionally, right? Someone like Tucker Carlson is pushed out of the corridors of power. Someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Thomas Massie is pushed out of the corridors of power, even though an increasingly large amount of the base, they're representing those views. And I think this is sort of lagging the Democratic Party by 5 years. It's very similar to what Democratic politics with Israel and Palestine were in 2021, where you had not a majority of the party base, but a significant minority, one that couldn't really be ignored, really souring and being disgusted by the U.S.-Israel relationship. And then you have various figures in the party who want to capture that energy, but don't actually want to capture that energy because they don't want to follow those policy implications to their fullest. And so you have a lot of sort of kayfabe, fake outs, right? This might be a strange comparison, or it might not be, but in a lot of ways, I think J.D. Vance is the AOC of this moment, sort of giving voice to these superficial criticisms of Israel, or, almost like a pressure release valve, while also, not really challenging the policies head on. Although I think AOC has moved further than where she was. And you're right that I think this has been a long time in the making. I mean, I was writing on my Substack, not to toot my own horn, but I was writing on my Substack around late 2022 and early 2023 that there was going to be a Republican crack up over Israel. I remember during one of the Republican primary debates, speaking of South Carolina, Nikki Haley said something like, Israel doesn't need America, America needs Israel. And then you had even, Matt Walsh at the Daily Wire, which is, the Ben Shapiro publication, coming out and being like, I think he called her America last or something. And I think it's because on one hand, you had this sort of foreign policy skepticism, this forever war skepticism, which at an institutional level was entirely just fake window dressing, kayfabe, kabuki theater, but representing a real thing within the Republican base. And a lot of that energy got sucked into agitating over the Ukraine proxy war and, ignoring this giant elephant in the room with the Middle East. Really, it was this weird, unsustainable contradiction where Republicans would say, we shouldn't be giving money and risking our geopolitical stability for Ukraine, and then being like, well, but Israel's different. Even before October 7th, this was becoming an increasingly obvious contradiction. I remember talking, in the run up to the 2024 election, I don't know if I should name the person or not. It doesn't really matter. But it was somebody who in conservative media who has since come out as much more Israel skeptical. But I remember, 2023 during the Republican primary, pre-October 7th, saying basically, I think that the Iran hawks are a lot more dangerous than the Russia hawks because this NATO and Ukraine stuff is very institutional. There's very stable rules for how this escalation can go and what the U.S. is doing. In the Middle East, it's really like unlimited. They have unlimited ambitions. If you listen to what they're actually saying, there's no real pushback. And what they want is something extremely destabilizing, which is a big war with Iran. And this person was like, well, no, but that can be all contained. But the Russia stuff is really dangerous because World War III. Not to say I told you so, but I think this person has come around to the idea that, well, I did kind of call what was going to happen. And then additionally, I think you have the sort of woke stuff, DEI, DE Israel transition, where, again, it's just this really conspicuous contradiction in the Republican political discourse because you have Republicans on one hand railing against identity politics, railing against woke, etc. And then suddenly they're justifying U.S. support for Israel in very identity politics, very woke ways.
I mean, and that's like super explicit, I'll add. It's not just that the language is reflective of a certain kind of identitarian style of advocacy. Like you literally have in the Trump administration instructions, direction from the White House to outfits like the Department of Education, the DOJ, of like, we are only going to do civil rights enforcement on anti-Semitism, like explicitly repurposing the legal infrastructure and administrative infrastructure around anti-discrimination to do the suppression of criticism of Israel.
Yes. And I think that's really conspicuous. I think that was even a thing before October 7th. Not the implementation, but the sort of Israel exception within DEI stuff that conservatives were trying to carve out. And I mean, on one hand, I think a lot of conservatives just saw it as like a reverse racism, like a gotcha. Like, oh, we found the marginalized group that the left is not including in its DEI. But then at some point, it just turns from calling out hypocrisy to embracing it. Look, I think there's a lot of ways in which this gets chalked up to anti-Semitism, and certainly anti-Semitism on the right exists. Like, you could listen to Nick Fuentes' show where he's like, oh yeah, the Shiites are based because they're fighting the Goyim against the Jews. But I do think there's also just a sense to which people on the right are having the same human reactions as people on the left to what was happening in Gaza and just to the Palestinian issue and the Middle East in general. They are consuming the same media. They are witnessing the same scenes. And you sort of end up in this funny sort of state where on the left, you had this whole thing of like, I'm not anti-Semitic. I just care about Palestinian rights. This kind of defensive crouch. On the right, I think you have the inverse where it's like, I don't care about Palestinian rights. I'm just anti-Semitic. And I think to some degree, it's actually covering for a human reaction to not only watching horrible things happen, but hearing genocidal rhetoric and sort of being spooked by it. But then because the right has different normative values and different discourses, they can't actually say like, oh, we care about the human rights of people being bombed and starved. So instead, they make it this convoluted, conspiratorial, dog-whistly racist thing. For all the hate that Marjorie Taylor Greene has gotten, and she's actually one of the most earnest people in those crowd, right? She's just like a sort of a kooky wine mom who believes everything she reads on the internet.
Q is a patriot. We know that for sure. It's not just Democrat and Republican, left and right. You can dive down in that civil war into deeper levels where we have basically the deep state is fighting back against President Trump, the loyal people in his administration, and the American people. Okay?
I mean, is it going to be true that the child pedophilia in the elites in the Washington, D.C., is that what we're really going to see come out? Is it true? Is the type of corruption we're going to see come out, is it going to be satanic worship that possibly all these people are involved in?
We all know someone like that. She's genuinely upset when she reads that Wayfair is hiding children in furniture to steal their adrenochrome, and she's also genuinely upset when she sees pictures of kids getting their limbs blown off in Gaza.
Right.
And she said so explicitly.
This is the thing that I get concerned about, not concerned about, but a bit skeptical about, is that when Tucker Carlson, for example, goes to Qatar and visits with Palestinian kids who have been injured, when he talks about all the things that Israel is doing in Gaza, oppressing Palestinian Christians and the like, my brain starts firing up, because had Israel done what it wanted to do in the initial days after October 7th, when it wanted to send everybody into Egypt through a humanitarian corridor, quote unquote, had they done that and had Gaza been demolished anyway, do you think that this kind of response would have even emerged in any real way among the right, even if functionally the same sort of things were happening?
So you bring up Tucker Carlson. I actually wanted to say that's a different case. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene is the most earnest out of that crowd. I think that a lot of the other people in that crowd, like Tucker and Matt Gaetz, they're not so earnest and unfiltered. And so they have to put it in these sort of conspiratorial or sneery or dog whistly ways. I certainly think that a lot of the Republican base is just upset by seeing human carnage. I think that someone like Tucker Carlson is certainly tapping into that. He knows how to make an emotional appeal. I think his motives are slightly different. I think that he's the kind of Republican who he represents, or not even Republican, just sort of, he represents a very glowy part of the deep state that sort of sees Israel and the U.S. commitment to the Middle East as like dangerous and destabilizing to the global empire, and they sort of want to like whip Israel back into line and sort of George H.W. Bush style make it a real proxy again and discipline it. But I do think also he is appealing to values of common decency, leaving aside his sort of hummus eater comments or whatever, which again, it's like these people can't just make an appeal to human decency, so they end up saying this other shit. But a lot of his arguments are just straightforward appeals, because I think that is something that his base is listening to and cares about, right? They're uneasy about seeing this level of carnage and destitution and trampling on human dignity. He's a figure of authority coming in and saying, no, you're right to feel that this is fucked up. And here's a sort of logical principles of why. But again, right, like, they have to add some element of like edginess or confrontation or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the violence was baked in. I think like the interesting tension is between the reaction that people have to seeing that. Because I mean, I also don't like a kind of like overly deterministic view of the role of technology and media in this sequence. But I do think there was something somewhat novel of this being a genocide that is projected through TikTok and Instagram or whatever into everyone's phones. And so you do have a phenomenon of people having a somewhat organic reaction to some of these grotesque images. And the kind of struggle between the Republican Party elites and figures and that reaction to try and launder that emotional response into one of the traditional channels of conservative ideology or worldview is like this fascinating interplay. You know, you mentioned Matt Gaetz. That was someone who people, and now this is my turn to not name names, people in the Palestine world that I was in conversation with years ago, you know, talking about like 2021 or something, were telling me about efforts to reach figures like Matt Gaetz in particular and do advocacy for Palestine through a kind of religious liberty angle of being like a lot of the suppression of pro-Palestine speech and criticism of Israel is fundamentally about Islamophobia and like really trying to lean into the religious liberty angle, which I was incredibly skeptical of at the time. I was just like, you are wasting your time. This is ridiculous. They don't actually care about that shit. Now that we're in this moment, it's just been fascinating to see how those inroads have produced real tensions. And I think it's important what you're saying about not wanting to overstate it, because it is true that I think there's been a lot of attention on some of these fractures, fault lines within the right. But if you zoom out, most of the action is happening within the Democratic Party's base. And most of the tension around Israel policy is happening with the Democrats. But I think it's important still to think about, because politics has a tendency to shift quite rapidly in the United States. And I guess I'm curious how you see Trump himself and like the MAGA world navigating this. Are they just kind of ignoring it, or are they doing their own version of trying to absorb that critique and launder it through their ideological project?
Well, Trump and MAGA world are two different things, right? Trump is not actually, it's like how Marx said, I'm not a Marxist. Trump is not actually MAGA. He's like a standard boomer Republican. I think that's very clear. He is literally a boomer. He's frozen in whatever talk shows he was watching in the 1980s. I think because he's very rhetorically slippery and also sort of built his movement around very marginal people within the Republican Party, people read more into that, and there is a sort of Trumpist movement that is very different. I think Trump himself is just like fully... can I say something off the record?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think Trump is fully just a typical Israel hug. Like, he is Lindsey Graham. He's President Lindsey Graham or something. But I think when you talk about MAGA world, I do think there is a lot of attempts to absorb and deflect the criticism. I think, for example, like Charlie Kirk, he was just like a vessel for the Republican coalition, like an avatar for all these different forces. And before his death, he wasn't turning against Israel. That's like so stupid when people claim that. I'm sorry, you have to have rocks in your brain. But he was sort of noticing and addressing this criticism, right? He wrote a letter to Netanyahu saying, you guys are losing the youth and here's how you can win them back. And then I remember Kirk having this weird TPUSA chapter head like struggle session, basically, where he had people basically ask what there was, like, their honest questions and doubts about Israel. You can air them now, and I'll like, and right, it's obviously meant to be like, oh yeah, well, we're not afraid to answer these questions, like sort of like, you know, a religious pastor being like, I'm not afraid to answer your doubts. But it was a sort of acknowledgement that this stuff was bubbling up. And I think JD Vance is very, I think he's sort of always too clever by half.
Members of the administration, between me and the president, what the president said consistently, going back to 2015, and I agreed with him, is that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon. We have taken this military action under the president's leadership. I think all of us, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, should pray for its success and pray for the safety of our troops. That's the approach that I've taken. Make it as successful as possible.
So there's no hesitation, given your past statements, with the current operation?
What do you mean there's no hesitation with my past statements?
Given your skepticism of foreign adventurism, you were a critic of the global war on terror previously.
Well, I think one big difference, Phil, is that we have a smart president, whereas in the past we've had dumb presidents. And I trust President Trump to get the job done, to do a good job for the American people, and to make sure that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated. Absolutely.
Thanks, sir.
But I think he believes that he's very slickly playing this. And he's being like, you know, we love Israel, but, you know, we have our differences or whatever. And again, I think the tension here is that on an elite level, the Republican Party is just really committed to Israel based on where it's the donors who butter its bread, its political interests, its values in terms of the establishment. The people who staff it, they're going to like really resist harder than the Democratic Party turning against Israel. At the same time that their base is, again, I like to say that they're undergoing what the Democrats did 5 years ago, and the trend line is towards where the Democrats are now. It's interesting that you said, oh, these people don't give a shit about the whatever, religious liberty or whatever, because I think there are people in the Republican base who do care about these ostensible values and who do notice when there's a big discrepancy and a big difference, and you sort of have to have an answer for that. And I don't think that the pro-Israel lobby really has an answer for that other than just like, shut the fuck up and obey your leaders. So this is, as you said, a tension that's just going to keep bubbling up, and there's going to be all sorts of ways to deflect it. And I think, yeah, as you said, most of the action is happening within the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is going to be much slower to catch up if it ever does. But it's a real tension. It's expressing something real. Matt Gaetz is another interesting guy because, again, like, I don't know if he is coming from the same place as Thomas Massey or Marjorie Taylor Greene, where they're just extremely earnest and hard-headed. I think that Gates has a personal vendetta against Israel. I don't know if it's too much of a tangent, but it is a funny vendetta to bring up. Are you guys familiar with it?
I don't know what you're referring to now.
Oh, so you remember the underage sex scandal?
I do, yes.
So Matt Gaetz was accused, and he was never charged with the crime, but just so that we're not on lawsuitable grounds, Matt Gaetz was found to have done this by a congressional committee, but not by a court of law, to be paying a teenage girl for sex. And when this first came out, he immediately came out swinging, being like, actually, I'm the victim of a blackmail scheme. And lo and behold, it turns out that there was a blackmail scheme, that some person involved in trying to free Robert Levinson, a rogue CIA agent, from Iranian captivity, needed money to pay someone for some ransom, maybe. And so went to Matt Gaetz' family and was like, basically, I know that he's under investigation for this thing and we can get him a pardon. And then, of course, Matt Gaetz' dad goes to the FBI about this because, what the fuck? Also, Robert Levinson, the guy who they were trying to ransom or whatever, had been declared dead by the U.S. government. So it's very unclear what the blackmailer was actually trying to accomplish. In the middle of all of this, the fucking Dilbert cartoonist shares his screenshots of his text messages with a press officer at the Israeli consulate in New York, who basically implied that he being the Israeli diplomat, was also part of this blackmail scheme, being like, Matt Gaetz was never blackmailed and this reporting is just totally burning and it was never followed up on. I think the Israeli consulate put out some statement being like, this guy was just working in a personal capacity, we have nothing to do with this. But there were never any follow-up questions. I'm like, wait, how did this guy get in on this blackmail scheme? What the fuck? So Gaetz, that I think is really when he started coming out swinging against Israel, because he felt personally surveilled by the Israeli state.
Wow. This, I guess, wraps into what I was going to ask about Vance and where he is in all of this. When I see the Democratic Party and how it is responding to Israel and what it's doing in Gaza, and the Democratic Party, I mean the base of it. As much as I have skepticisms about what they will do once they are in power, there is a definite sea change within a lot of Democratic voters where they actually want to see someone who thinks fundamentally differently and will govern fundamentally differently. And when I see Carlson, when I see Marjorie Taylor Greene, I don't follow Matt Gaetz' stuff very closely, but I assume he's in a similar category. It seems like they are teeing up the GOP to support Vance whole hog in 2028, with the understanding that he will somehow be a voice for anti-war messaging, despite having been a part of the team that executed the disastrous Iran war. Would you agree that's what they're doing here, that it's not something that's going to stay for very long, this sea change among a lot of right-wing voters?
The Vance thing. Yeah, I think some of these guys are teeing up to support Vance. I don't know each individual one, where they stand or where they might stand. I do think that Vance sort of understands that to be his lane. I don't think Vance believes in anything, but I think he's happy to make that his lane in the Republican Party, especially if he doesn't actually have to follow through on it. I think Carlson is sort of working on a more generational project of moving the party. I think Carlson, again, does have a little bit more genuine disgust with Israel, but it's not necessarily out of a genuine humanitarian or principled sentiment. I think, again, he is sort of representing people who want to realign the U.S. empire. And then I think that Thomas Massey, who's, a credit for libertarians there, he is probably the one sane and earnest person in that crowd.
Certainly. One out of many. I would definitely trust Massey's. He's been very consistent about this with regards to American foreign policy.
Yeah, but I think that so you have on one level, you have Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who actually sort of are part of this change within the base. And then you have people like Gaetz and Carlson, who are a step removed from that, where they're representing a constituency that's motivated by this. And then you have, at the furthest out, you have Vance, who sort of does not give a shit and is willing to, he will brief the media on whatever he thinks advantages him in 2028, but he understands that this is his lane. Whether what that actually looks like policy-wise remains to be seen. I suspect that, again, it's going to be a lot of like rhetorical deflection or sort of saying, oh, I tried, but Congress tied my hands kind of thing. But, again, I do think if we end up with a President Vance and we're still in this standoff with Iran and Israel's still agitating for more war, it will be a little bit of a shit or get off the pot kind of moment for him.
Yeah, I'm curious about that, right? Because on your telling, it sounds like Vance is more in a position of trying to absorb critique, but maintain some level of continuity because that's the path of least resistance, like in the halls of power, et cetera. And doesn't really want to pick a fight with the forces that have sustained the U.S.-Israel relationship. Whereas you describe Tucker as having a longer, more generational view on the realignment of U.S. empire. And I'm wondering if you could just say more, like put a little meat on the bones there. Like, what is the vision? Like, if we can say that Tucker represents a newer, more updated vision of the U.S.'s role in the world that maybe accounts for some of the realities in the way that the inertia of the neoconservatives don't. What is that world? Like, what is the ideal world that Tucker wants to see, and what is the U.S.'s role in it?
Ooh, that's a good question. What does Tucker Carlson want from the world? I think what I said with George H.W. Bush in Israel is what I imagine that he's going for, right? Not cutting Israel loose or destroying Israel, but making it a proxy, making it submissive, making it play ball with broader U.S. interests and sort of be a more sustainable apartheid, right? Sort of consolidate its gains instead of pushing for more, play ball with the Arab states. And just as Israel has to balance with other U.S. interests in the Middle East has to balance with other U.S. interests worldwide. So against U.S. interests in Europe and Asia. I think in Europe also, Carlson sort of believes that the U.S. has pushed too far against Russia and wants to sort of settle things with Russia from a position of strength, from a position where the U.S. is still ensconced in Europe, but maybe sort of retrenches a little bit out of Eastern Europe. Ironically, I think that the Carlson vision is very similar to the Obama vision. Even the Nick Fuentes vision, somebody asked him well, how would you handle Israel and Iran? And he's like, well, I would, make sure that Israel has to abide by XYZ thing. And then I would reach out to Iran and offer them a normalization, but if they don't do that, then I would sanction them and threaten. And it's like, okay, so this is Obama again.
Yeah.
I don't think this is just a case of fecklessness or something. I think it's sort of like how crabs independently evolved a bunch of times. This is just what the circumstances call for if you are really trying to generationally make U.S. empire sustainable. And I think the reason why this doesn't work is because there are forces within U.S. empire domestically and sort of within the client states that just can't take a W or an L. They just can't settle things. They have to keep pushing.
Yeah, that is the relationship, right? It's dynamic. There are pressures pushing in both directions. And especially when you have a settler colonial entity that is engaged in the active dispossession of the native, that continuous generation of enemies and territorial expansion is essential for keeping their own domestic order. And there's all kinds of consequences to that. So yeah, I do think it's trying to get a hold on something or put the lid on something that fundamentally can't be contained. And this is kind of the forward momentum of empire. I did want to talk, though, about how Israel is responding to all of this, right? Because, clearly there's a lot shifting domestically in terms of popular perception of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And we are starting to see institutional Zionism formulate a response to that. And, as we mentioned, or kind of discussed along other terms, right? In the years leading up to October 7th, the response or the approach that Israel took was really about normalizing Israel with positive association. And that involved things like entry into the Identity Club, right? And a lot of the PR around Israel in the 2010s was to brand Judaism and Israel identity and like the whole idea that criticism of Israel is a form of anti-Semitism, to try and wedge that into shifting popular ideas about discrimination, about historical injustice, etc., to be like, we are one of the people who deserve your kind of deference in like a, standpoint epistemology, lived experience type of way. And it kind of seems like that project is basically dead. I mean, I think you still see versions of it, but it doesn't really seem to be persuading anyone. It seems now what we're seeing from institutional Zionism is this effort to push the US-Israel relationship more into the background. And interestingly, the first people I noticed doing this were AIPAC, because for years now, when AIPAC has intervened in domestic congressional races, etc., they don't really message on Israel. It's like there's other groups that message on Israel, but usually AIPAC, when they want to influence an election, they play to domestic stuff. So they talk about, whatever issue they think is going to appeal to that domestic constituency. And they're not like doing necessarily explicitly pro-Israel messaging. But now we're seeing that broader strategy of pushing that relationship, the US-Israel relationship, to the background, coming to the fore in some of these debates and initiatives around the US-Israeli military relationship and alliance. Because, for many years now, the US has provided Israel with direct military assistance that comes in the forms of grants. And there's growing scrutiny on this. These actually come under congressional oversight, etc. And there are now new efforts to wind that down, but also reintegrate or integrate that relationship more upstream in the production process and around intelligence. So can you just tell me about some of those efforts and like the reporting you've done on them and some of the debates around them?
So I see we're talking about the U.S.-Israel military integration bill, or as people have been calling it. And I think this is another case where people are both downplaying and overplaying what's going on here. This is a bill that is pretty explicitly, the plan is to phase out direct U.S. grants to Israel. As I wrote in early 2023, those were always like giving taxpayer money to Israel was always going to be a lightning rod. I mean, you even had Tablet magazine in early 2023, before October 7th, talking about why don't we just cut off this aid because it's sort of golden handcuffs on Israel and it's a political distraction from the values that really bind us with Israel. AKA, please stop talking about this thing that makes Israel look really bad and only talk about the U.S.-Israel relationship in really vague terms, never in terms of costs. It is a lightning rod because you don't need a master's degree to understand what it means when like government take money from your pocket, give it to other country. Unlike a lot of the other sort of elements of U.S. support for Israel, which are these more arcane diplomatic or military things, or these sort of unspoken threats to go to war. And so the U.S.-Israel Futures Act is sort of an attempt to phase out direct financial grants to Israel, and instead basically mandates that the U.S. Department of Defense open up co-production with Israel. So it's not that the U.S. and Israeli militaries are like under the same command structure or something, but it's that the Pentagon basically co-produces missiles with Israel or bombs or whatever, so that they're getting them from the same factory, so that it is the R&D and the supply chains and everything are subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer, but in a way that's kind of invisible and nebulous. There was another bill, and this has passed. This is going to be part of the military budget, unless it gets taken out by some congressional action before they send it to the president's desk. There was another bill by Tom Cotton. I haven't followed up on that more recently, but I think it sort of gives the game away, where he wanted to put it in the military budget that would forbid the U.S. president from cutting off intelligence sharing with Israel unless the president can sort of show an imminent national security threat. So it's literally like, we have to maintain their panopticon. They have to have all the information, which is a mandate that not even the other Five Eyes, if your listeners are familiar with that, have. And I think that's the direction it's going, towards more intangible forms of support. I don't know if that will be enough. I feel like this is closing the barn door after the horse has been let out, because, right, we've already gotten to the point of like the U.S. explicitly bombing Iran on behalf of Israel. So I don't know if you can make this a hidden relationship again.
Yeah.
They'll try. Maybe voters are stupid and will forget about everything. But that's sort of the direction they're going in.
Just with the Cotton Bill, do you know if that is reciprocal?
No. How can the U.S. Congress compel Israel to... Right. How can they... So it's not reciprocal. And I mean, Tom Cotton tried to... And again, here's the interesting thing, is that Tom Cotton tried to justify it as basically saying, well, Israeli intelligence has saved American lives and property in the Middle East. I mean, who knows, right? It's sort of by design. It's a claim that you can't verify. Right? Like, what does that have to do with anything? Why are we mandating? It's a one-way mandate, so it doesn't actually help. It doesn't actually ensure that. And on the other hand, the Futures Act, Mike Rogers tried to justify this as like, basically it doesn't do anything, right? Like we're not, there's no military integration. We're just, it's just a few lines about R&D and ensuring some R&D advance. Like this is just some boring bureaucratic thing. Pay no attention to it, which is like, as Josh Paul, the former U.S. State Department guy in charge of arms sales, who's now a very pro-Palestine figure, said to me, if the bill doesn't do anything, then why have it? And why have it only for Israel? So I think it was actually the Quincy Institute that broke this story. So props to my former employers on the Futures Act. So this stuff is a little bit too clever by half, because sure, you can hide these things in the sort of bureaucracy, and that has been an Israeli strategy for a long time, to sort of hide pro-Israel tripwires or poison pills or sort of guarantees of support in legislation. But now you actually do have counterfactions of the elite who will be looking for these things and making them public and making them controversies. I mean, are you familiar with like qualitative military edge?
Mm-hmm. We discussed it last News of the Week with regards to Turkey and the F-35s.
Sure. Okay. So for years, just as a quick recap for anyone who's just tuning in now, for years, U.S. Congress has just written into its arms control laws that like U.S. policy has to ensure that Israel has more powerful military equipment than its neighbors. And this was just it's a crazy thing if you think about it, but it's also was totally unremarkable thing that was like quietly buried into the law, not really covered in the press except for like very specialty pro-Israel or like defense industry press. And I think if they tried to pass something like that now, it would actually be a matter of debate. You would actually have someone kind of bring this to the media and make a big stink about it. I think that does sort of go to the importance of like elite factions and sort of how manufacturing consent works, where it's not necessarily that there's a conspiracy of silence, but it's just like these things are so unremarkable. They're accepted as just what power does and business as usual. And so now I think the sort of crack up is not just that you have people who are angry at Israel but don't understand, if it was just the case of people who are angry about Israel but they don't understand arms control law or UN votes or whatever, that would be less dangerous to Israel than if you now have competing factions of the US elite who do understand these things and are willing to like fund a think tank or what have you that will like write papers about the downsides and trade-offs and make this into a matter of public debate. And I think you're right that like the sort of Israeli pivot now is actually to try to shrink away from public debate and normalize itself and make itself less remarkable and make the U.S. support for Israel more invisible. And I think, to some extent, you talk about the difference 10 years ago with they're trying to make a positive social justice case for Israel. I actually think there's a lot of continuity here because the positive case for Israel, even if they're not making it so much anymore, was always predicated on like, let's keep it vague and not actually talk about like concrete, hard policy. What is the U.S. doing for Israel? Just talk about like the sort of vague, happy, good feelings we have towards Israel.
Yeah, totally. I want to be clear. When I said that, I did not mean that they were trying to have a conversation about the Palestinians, but precisely the opposite, that the way that they intended to deflect that conversation away is through that strategy of intentional positive association. You had things like pink washing and greenwashing, saying Israel is this haven for LGBT. Israel is this, thriving democracy in the Middle East. Israel is this climate forward place. And if you bring up its domestic problem, then you're engaging in anti-Semitism. So it is just totally like another way not to have the conversation. And I think that what's interesting about this particular strategy, right, is that I think it is setting up a buffer to absorb the critique, right? To like set up a scenario in which some positive political momentum towards reducing or cutting US aid to Israel will not actually be consequential. It will have been anticipated and be part of the Zionist project itself. So whether that happens through Republicans or Democrats, I think it is a hedge in a certain sense. But it also kind of relies on, I think, some ambiguity in the messaging around US support for Israel. Because I think that when people criticize Israel in basic terms, a lot of it is like, we give them all of these weapons for free, which they are using to violate international law, to commit genocide, etc., which I think misapprehends what is so essential for Israel about US patronage. It's not the financial grant, right? It's not that Israel can't afford to pay for these arms. It's that their entire defensive systems rely on weapons and missiles, shells that are only produced in the United States, are produced by the US defense industry. And so it's not that they couldn't afford to pay for them if they were not granted for free by the United States. It's that if they didn't have access to those shells and those missiles, their systems would not work. They would need to make or produce entire new defensive systems that they, as a very small country with a relatively small industrial base in comparison to the United States, they're not able to produce. And so that's why, from a political point of view, insisting on a total arms embargo on Israel, so not just that the US is not giving Israel any of these weapons, but that it is actually legally forbidden for US companies to provide these weapons to Israel. That is the thing that would actually hamper Israel's ability to continue to start wars, commit genocide, etc. That's the thing that they wouldn't be able to live without. And so I think there's a bit of a kind of bait and switch happening where they want to absorb that energy and channel it into something that won't actually hamper their ability to do what they're doing.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, though, it's not just that even like that the US arms Israel regardless of the aid, it's also that like the entire US order in the Middle East is arranged to make things easier for Israel. The United States military is there to stand in between Israel and anyone who would attack it. And there are massive amounts of guns and money that go to states that play nice with Israel, whether openly or like the UAE or like even with Syria, right? The US has sort of created I don't think that Ahmed al-Shara, some people, I guess, some of your listeners will stop listening at this point. I don't think Ahmed al-Shara is a closet Zionist or something. I think he just does care about like his interests and the interests of the Syrian state. But the US has structured the interests of the Syrian state so that if they oppose Israel doing land grabs inside of Syria, then the US will impose an even higher cost, sort of almost automatically and sort of quietly with sanctions, with embargoes, with sort of turning the other states against Syria and doing things that make it harder for Shara to rule the country. And on the converse, if you are a fucked up state, like one that really has threats to its rule, but you play nice with Israel, the US will do a lot of things that will make it hard for domestic and foreign enemies to oppose you. I think Bahrain is a great example of this. I don't want to get into the whole history of Bahrain right now, but I mean, this is a sort of the whole thing is built around keeping sort of, it's like how NATO was structured, as they say, to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. The sort of Abraham Accords order, whatever you want to call it, the aircraft carrier, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, is designed to keep Israelis in, the Iranians out, and the Palestinians down.
Yeah. And I think like one thing to kind of bring it to the present, right? One thing this war, the US-Israeli war on Iran, has demonstrated is that there are some hard limits to this strategy from the US imperial point of view. And perhaps that is part of what has motivated an attempt or, a kind of counter movement from folks within the GOP who want to realign the American empire, because they see the ways in which maintaining this arrangement has some severe negative effects on the US posture in the world. And one kind of proxy for that is something that you've written about. I think you wrote a piece in June about this, which is the kind of quote unquote interceptor math, which is, a topic at the peak of the Iran war was getting a lot of attention. But basically the nut of it is that it's way more expensive to produce the kinds of air defense systems and their components that populate this structure that you've just been describing. It's way more expensive to produce those systems that are designed to shoot down, ballistic missiles and drones, than it is for states like Iran to produce those missiles and drones, and especially the drones. And the reason for that, right, is that it's very slow to make the interceptors. We don't just have a fully mobilized defense industrial base that can just spit them out, and it's relatively cheap to make the drones. And so I think what we've seen in this war as it's played out is that Iran's ability to wear down the United States in a conflict like this has exposed a weakness in the broader US military posture in the region that is built around defending Israel. Do you see this as a material problem for the US strategy in the region, especially just thinking about wars and how they're fought now, thinking about Ukraine in particular and the prevalence of drones in that war, and also just what Iran has been able to prove with its missile program?
I actually think it's a much more a material problem than a financial problem, right? I think that sort of talking about using $1 million missile to shoot down a $50,000 drone is almost missing the point, because if you've got $1 billion and your enemy only has 50 million, then the math still works out in your favor. But like you said, it's really a question of like, how quickly can you produce these things? The things that Iran and its allies fire can be produced cheaply, easily, in dispersed ways. They can be sort of built out of parts that are smuggled. And I think despite U.S. attempts to hit the bottlenecks of Iranian weapons production, we haven't really seen a sort of crippling blow. On the other hand, air defense interceptors take time to build. They require, specialized materials. You have to source cruise missiles, which are not interceptors. They're offensive weapons. But I remember reading about the fan blades on the fucking cruise missiles are a super specialized part that needs machining, and one factory can do that, and it's competing with civilian jet engines. And then you have all kinds of parts like that, specialized parts in a missile that can, chase down another missile and knock out of the sky. Even the personnel are a bottleneck, because you have to have not only skilled engineers, but skilled engineers with security clearances working on these production lines. So there's just sort of a limit to how much you can build these precision munitions. And there's no insurmountable limit, right? War is always a matter of adaptation. We see in Ukraine, there's a sort of constant adaptation between both sides. You have a measure and countermeasure, etc. But the deeper problem here is that the whole U.S. order in the Middle East is predicated on not becoming something like Ukraine. It's supposed to be one-sided. It's supposed to be an order in which the United States and Israel and the Gulf states can bomb their neighbors at will and at very little cost, and they will not get bombed. And I think with the Iran war, we've had the first time where, Israel has been bombed over and over again, but I think you have the first time where the Gulf states were bombed, really, and the first time when Israel was bombed in a way where its air defenses were just not able to keep up.
Exactly.
And not only that, but you also have, if we're talking about economics and trade-offs, the U.S. has trade-offs with other parts of the world. It may be that they actually can, I don't know, I can't predict the future, and I don't know exactly how much Iran has in its stockpile. It may be that the U.S. could bring enough missiles from all of its stockpiles all around the world to the Middle East to shoot down every single remaining Iranian missile until the end of this conflict. But then you leave the rest of the world naked. You already started to see these trade-offs in Ukraine, where there is an active war, and yet they're not getting enough of what they need. And you have trade-offs with future conflicts in Asia. Now, I'm more and more skeptical that the U.S. is actually going to fight China over Taiwan, but there's still an interest in keeping a military posture in places like Japan and Taiwan. And you had the Undersecretary of the Navy explicitly say to Congress that they just couldn't fulfill their arms sales, not aid, but sales to Taiwan because of how many missiles they've burned up in the Iran war.
You wrote about this pretty recently, and there was a bit in there that was pretty striking to me. That backlog is like $30 billion of weapons that have not been delivered. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. That is just totally crazy to me. I mean, in part, I share your skepticism that the U.S. is going to fight a war with China, but it is really more about some of these material conflicts and how this war is playing out that make that the case, or that lead me to think that, because it does stand in pretty sharp contrast to how people in the Trump world, and really in both parties, have been talking about China for years, right? You talked about a kind of quasi-Obama-esque vision of the U.S. role in the world, and that vision was about pivoting to Asia. Now, of course, the Obama vision of how to confront China was in a grand kind of economic zones. That flopped pretty tremendously in terms of the domestic political blowback. And, it seems like a lot of the rhetoric after that was about getting tougher in different ways. But because of this military drawdown in the Iran war and what the Iran war has exposed about the limits of U.S. military ability or political willingness to engage in these kinds of conflicts if they can't keep the casualties down with kind of overwhelming air defense, I think has pushed Trump into a more dovish position with respect to China. And, we see that in terms of how he's approaching his summit with Xi, and that kind of, more of a push in recent months to take a more conciliatory approach with respect to the trade war he's in, et cetera. But I wonder if there is a chance, and I guess this would be very much asking you to speculate, but if there is a chance that there are people out there in China who perceive this as a moment of weakness for the United States and an opportunity to dramatically change the facts on the ground, say with an invasion of Taiwan, because I just don't know how the U.S. establishment would respond to something like that.
Well, the thing is, I think China's also kind of chicken shit. I mean, if they really wanted to bleed the U.S., there is a lot more levers they could pull. And it seems like not only have they not helped Iran, but they've actually sort of blunted the impact of Iranian retaliation by drawing down their own oil reserves. So I'm kind of leaning towards the sort of U.S.-Chinese world empire sort of duopoly thing. But I mean, this is sort of way out from what we're talking about. I do want to add one thing about willingness to fight and sort of balancing against the rest of the world, and sort of ties into what we were talking about earlier. When J.D. Vance gave his big foreign policy speech to the Quincy Institute in 2024, I was one of the few people who was really calling bullshit on whatever he was. I think I wrote that he was attacking neocons while adopting all of their premises, claimed that this was some fresh new approach to the Middle East by, bring Israel and the Arab states together so the U.S. can get out of the way. And I pointed out how this was exactly the white paper that Feith and Wolfowitz wrote in the Clean Break paper in 1999. Anyways, there was a part in that speech where Vance complained that the Biden administration had, quote, forced the Israelis to empty their munition stockpile and give it all to the Ukrainians, unquote. Well,
sound familiar?
Yes, but also very funny what he's actually referring to. He's talking about the war reserve stock. This is not an Israeli stockpile. This is an American stockpile that the U.S. government called War Reserve Stockpile Europe. It's for a European war. But the U.S. very quietly decided, I forgot when even, to just put it in Israel and tell the Israel, like it's a warehouse for a United States European command, meant for exactly the kind of contingency that happened in Ukraine, but they just put it in a warehouse somewhere in the Negev desert, and they told the Israelis, you can just use this. You can just dip into it whenever you want. And then when the Ukraine war happened, the U.S. actually had to ship a bunch of artillery shells from that stockpile to Ukraine, which is like the explicit purpose of having this thing around. And then the Israelis went and complained to Vance, they're taking our weapons. And of course, Vance, you know, whether he knows what he's doing or not, just repeated that to the fucking Quincy Institute because he thinks this is a good point against, this is how you're sticking it to the neocons. I just thought that was too perfect of like how this ties everything together. Going back to the question you asked about casualty aversion, I do think that China, though, I maybe went a little bit too far talking about duopoly. I do think that China is very cautious about this, but does see a moment of U.S. weakness. I think they would much prefer to sort of have a fait accompli in Taiwan and just be able to sort of muscle the island into compliance without a war. And that requires them to get to the point where the U.S. is just so weak that it won't even be on the table to defend Taiwan. Although I also suspect that the U.S. will not let that happen, both for ideological and material reasons. I think in general, I think that maybe 3 years ago or 2 years ago, the U.S., or really before that, sort of post-Obama, the U.S. elite was sort of presented with a choice. Like, you can have a sustainable world empire and the ability to fight wars everywhere, or you can have this sort of Middle Eastern forever war in a specifically structured where you can bomb whoever you want and they can't bomb you back, and sort of Israeli panopticon and crushing everyone in the region like bugs under a magnifying glass. And then the US elite chose the latter. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that choice. The U.S. is very firmly entrenched militarily in the Middle East. It couldn't get what it wanted with Iran, but hasn't stopped trying. And at the same time, I think there is no doubt that the U.S. cannot fight this kind of war anywhere else in the world, except maybe Latin America, where there just literally is no resistance. I don't think that we're going to see a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. I mean, maybe I'll eat my words. Maybe I have manifested one into existence tomorrow. Or by the time this airs, you know, as Donald Trump likes to say, you know, anything could happen. A bomb could fall on me right now. But I think that, this does definitely mark a moment. This is a sort of inflection point in the US-China competition for power. And I think that I've seen all this like LARPy stuff about how Iran is the fourth world power now. It has something stronger than a nuclear bomb. It's thoroughly defeated the US. I don't think we can like say that for certain. I don't know how they're going to come out of this with a lot of problems. I don't know if they'll actually push the U.S. out in the Middle East. This could really be a Pyrrhic victory, but I do think that we can say for certain that this was the sort of last hurrah of the sort of U.S. model of omnipotence in the Middle East. And this is going to have serious consequences for the U.S. model of omnipotence everywhere else.
I wanted to ask about the U.S. staying in the Middle East more generally, because these U.S. bases that continue to be bombed by Iran after the MOU has been apparently declared over, I'm not sure about how much the Iranians accept that, they've suffered significant damage, you know, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in repairs that are required to bring them up to full capacity. They don't seem to have been very well protected. They were attacked by F-5s in those early days of the war. They're able to be bombed and have U.S. soldiers killed on their premises by very outdated machinery. And there does seem to be discussion, or at least a movement happening, that indicates that these bases are not going to be very long for this world. And I'm wondering, what is the likelihood you see of that actually occurring, even if the U.S. maintains a certain high-level presence in the Middle East militarily? And what do you also make of these proposals by Israel to instead move all of these bases into Israeli territory itself, where theoretically all of its different missile defense systems could better protect it? I mean, look, I have my own skepticism, but that is also, he's talking about, bringing all the Arab oil pipelines straight into Israel, but I don't think that that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if the U.S. pulls out of the Gulf bases, it's going to be done in the most dragged-out, face-saving way possible. It's ironic for all this talk about how various Middle Eastern savages are so honor-obsessed. I think the U.S. is actually very, very honor-obsessed to the point where it really can't cut its losses. I mean, they might even just stay in those bases just to make a point, even if they keep getting bombed over and over again. But I think, yeah, if the U.S. does, I do think it's probably true that the Gulf bases have proven militarily to be liabilities more than assets. And if the U.S. does withdraw from them, it probably will be done in a face-saving sort of way where they will never, ever, ever, ever admit that they're doing it or that they were forced to do it. And I do think, de facto, during the Iran war, the U.S. military was all concentrated in Israel and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, but Israel especially. Ben Gurion Airport was just completely filled with tankers. Like, the entire U.S. tanker fleet was there, and in various bases in the Negev desert. The U.S. bombing missions were run out of bases further from Iran, such as, again, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. And I think it's sort of quietly accepted that if there is another, one of the signs that combat is going to resume will be if the U.S. starts pulling stuff out of the Gulf bases. That doesn't sound like they're long for the world. I won't say 100% that the U.S. will pull out, because, again, they might do something out of really stubborn pride and then really, just like in Vietnam, out of the urge to save face and avoid embarrassment, drag it out until they're really embarrassed and humiliated by some, missile hitting a staging point and killing hundreds of Americans or something. But yeah, I would say that the trend does seem to be that the U.S. will move out of the Gulf and concentrate in Israel. And I think that'll just make the whole thing a lot more explicit, right? The U.S. went into the Middle East in the 70s, basically by inheriting the British Empire's constellation of bases in the Gulf with the ostensible purpose of protecting oil in the Gulf and maintaining stability in the Gulf. And now, it turns out that actually they're jeopardizing stability in the Gulf and abandoning the region in order to concentrate military power in Israel. This was actually long in the making, because a lot of the preparations, I wrote an article that I can send you about how a lot of the preparations for a future war with Iran involved very quietly building U.S. defense infrastructure in Israel that could be used, and bringing Israel from U.S. European Command to U.S. Central Command, which is the central, not as in administratively central, central as in it covers the Middle East. And this was pretty explicitly done as practice for a future U.S. war with Iran. It was never, it was sort of quiet. It wasn't really loudly announced in the media, but yeah, that's what they admitted it was for. And this was being done as early as 2019, but now we're seeing it actually be made explicit. I mean, the other half of that, right, is, as we've talked about, on one hand, they're trying to make the cost of U.S. support for Israel as invisible as possible. On the other hand, this move is making it as explicit and visible, right? It's not just about Israel using U.S. weapons. It's not just about U.S. pressure on countries in the region. It is American soldiers as human shields in Israel. It's Americans fighting Israeli wars. I mean, you had Marco Rubio's comment, right? The reason we attacked Iran is basically because Israel was going to do it and be exposed to retaliation.
Yeah.
I think back to Jeffrey Goldberg in like 2011 or 2012, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, also former Israeli prison guard, wrote a very offended article about someone talking about U.S. soldiers being asked to die for Israel. He's like, they've never been asked to die for Israel. They've only been asked to die for Arab states, and Israelis wouldn't even want you to die for them because that goes against the sort of Zionist ideal of self-sufficiency.
Zionist ideal of self-sufficiency.
Fast forward, what, like 10, 15 years, and now it's like, yes, Americans will have to die for Israel, and if you're against this, you're anti-Semitic. And this has always been the case.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is as good a place as any to wrap up our conversation. Mr. Matthew Petti, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all of your intrepid reporting. I'm always looking for an opportunity to say intrepid reporting, but your reporting is indeed intrepid. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Legalize being libertarian.
That message is not endorsed by the Turbulence podcast.
We're cutting that out.